August 2024 Public Finance and Taxation paper, number 5. We read the question. Argue 4 cases against indirect taxes imposed in your country. We put the question down. Argue 4 cases against indirect taxes imposed in your country. Number 1, very important to understand, is to know what indirect taxes are. We say that indirect taxes, the impact is on one person and the incidence is on another person. When you talk about impact, that is basically the responsibility to pay tax, and the incidence of tax is the burden of tax. A given example of an indirect tax is the VAT. Most of the times, consumers, one of the things they are not aware that are paying tax, but VAT is an example of an indirect tax, where the seller or the trader remit the taxes to the Kenya Revenue Authority, but the people who bear the burden are the consumer, the buyer of the product. So one of the cases against is that it lack of civic consciousness. Consumers sometimes are not aware they're paying tax. Lack of what they call civic consciousness. Lack of civic consciousness. Those paying the taxes, are not even aware they are paying the taxes. Those that are basically paying the taxes are not even aware that they are paying the taxes. Number 2, we talk about the uncertain. Revenue is very uncertain. You cannot estimate the amount of uncertain. We say that uncertain in terms of revenue collection. You cannot estimate the amount of revenue that actually is supposed to come from the indirect taxes. So we can say number 2, we call it uncertain. We call it the uncertain revenue. Just say the government cannot estimate the revenue. We say the revenue coming from the indirect taxes. The government cannot estimate the revenue coming from the indirect taxes. And number 3, as a disadvantage, it leads to inflation, or basically we can say it feeds in inflation. Basically, levying indirect taxes makes the commodity prices to increase. And by the commodity prices increasing, that basically leads to inflation. So we say number 3, we say feeds, leads to inflation. Indirect taxes, we say results to an increase in the prices of commodities, thereby leading to inflation. That is the third point on that. And number 4, as a point on that, we can talk about uneconomical. Uneconomical meaning the cost of collection of these taxes basically is heavy. For some indirect taxes, for example, you find that, you will have to put officers in check in order for you to collect those taxes. So we can say uneconomical. On the fourth one, we call it uneconomical. That is to say, these taxes are uneconomical, in that the cost of collection to the state is heavy, in that the collection to the state is heavy due to the number, we say due to the number of officers, that are required. And lastly, very important as an additional point, we talk about what we call regressive. They are regressive in nature. The rate of VAT, for example, is 16%. And that basically applies to both the rich and the poor. And at the end of the day, we realize that in an economy or in a society, the higher number of people in society are the poor. So the poor ends up paying more burden than the rich. So that is what we call regressive. So we can add that as an additional point to that. We have 5. We call it regressive. We call it regressive. Indirect taxes. Indirect taxes are paid at the same rate by both the poor and the rich. Are paid at the same rate by both the poor and the rich. And the poor constitute a higher population than the rich. This leads to the poor. This leads to the poor paying, we say, a higher proportion than the rich. This leads to the poor paying a higher proportion than the rich. So we say that they're paid at the same rate. And therefore, when you look at the canons of taxation, one of the canons is basically equity. There's no equity in this. Because if those that have a lot of income are basically paying the same amount, and if you look at an economy, we basically have the poor constituting a larger proportion, we will see that when it talks about indirect taxes, it is the poor that basically constitute a higher percentage than the rich. Maybe a takeaway home as learners. It's better to look at even the cases, the positive cases about indirect taxes. But apart from the indirect taxes as a way of learning, you can also look at the direct taxes. What are direct taxes? The disadvantages of the indirect tax of the direct taxes. That is how we basically handle that question 5, Roman A.